The Friday the 13th franchise has terrified audiences for over 4 decades, creating one of horror cinema's most enduring icons. Jason Voorhees, the hockey-masked killer stalking Camp Crystal Lake, has become synonymous with slasher films, inspiring countless sequels, reboots, and imitators. Yet unlike many horror villains whose origins are purely fictional, Jason's creation involved complex inspirations drawn from real fears, tragedies, and cultural anxieties that continue to resonate today. Friday the 13th premiered in 1980, created by director Sean S. Cunningham and writer Victor Miller as a response to the massive success of John Carpenter's Halloween 2 years earlier. The slasher subgenre was emerging, and Cunningham saw commercial opportunity in creating something similar but distinct. What resulted was a film that would define horror for a generation. Interestingly, Jason Voorhees wasn't the killer in the original Friday the 13th's mother. Pamela Voorhees was the antagonist, seeking revenge for her son's drowning at Camp Crystal Lake due to counselor negligence. Jason appeared only as a deformed child in flashbacks and a shocking final dream sequence. It wasn't until Friday the 13th Part 2 that Jason became the primary killer, beginning his transformation into the unstoppable force we recognize today. This origin story, a child drowning due to adult negligence, followed by a mother's vengeful rampage, tapped into several powerful fears. The vulnerability of children, the failure of those entrusted with their care, the primal fury of a grieving parent, and the idea that past sins inevitably return for retribution. These themes gave the franchise emotional weight beyond simple violence. Jason's appearance evolved across films. Initially portrayed with a burlap sack covering his deformed face, he didn't don his iconic hockey mask until Part 3. This mask would become one of horror's most recognizable images, a blank, emotionless face that removes all humanity while creating an unforgettable visual. The simplicity of the design is key to its effectiveness. Accessible, easily reproduced, immediately identifiable. Understanding Jason Voorhees requires examining the cultural moment that birthed him. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw significant anxiety about youth culture, sexual liberation, and the perceived breakdown of traditional values. Horror films of this era often reflected these tensions, particularly around teenage sexuality and independence. Summer camps occupy a specific place in American culture spaces where young people gain independence from parental supervision, often for the first time. They represent a transitional zone between childhood and adulthood, where teenagers navigate social dynamics, romantic interests, and personal responsibility. This liminal quality makes camps perfect settings for horror narratives about the dangers of independence and the punishment of transgressive behavior. The slasher subgenre has been extensively analyzed for its moral framework, where characters who engage in sexual activity, drug use, or other rebellious behaviors typically die first, while the final girl, usually virginal and sensible, survives. Friday the 13th exemplified this pattern, though whether it was reinforcing conservative values or simply following commercial formulas remains debated. Camp Crystal Lake becomes a space where the normal rules don't apply, where adult authority is absent or ineffective, and where punishment comes swiftly for those who violate unstated moral codes. Jason serves as enforcer of these rules, a monstrous superego punishing ID-driven behavior. His muteness and lack of personality make him a blank slate for projection. He represents whatever moral judgment audiences bring to the narrative. Jason's character evolved significantly across 12 films and counting, various reboots, crossovers, and media adaptations. This evolution reflects changing audience expectations, filmmaking technology, and cultural shifts over 4 decades. Tracking these changes reveals how horror responds to and shapes popular consciousness. Early films portrayed Jason as more human, capable of being injured, showing some tactical thinking and operating with at least minimal morality, often sparing children. As the franchise progressed, he became increasingly superhuman, surviving injuries that would kill any human, returning from apparent death repeatedly, and displaying supernatural strength and resilience. This transformation from human killer to supernatural force changed the narrative dynamics. Suspense gave way to spectacle, with increasingly elaborate and creative kill scenes becoming the franchise's primary appeal. Jason became less a character than a force of nature, inevitable, unstoppable, eternally returning. This shift parallels broader changes in horror cinema toward more explicit violence and supernatural elements. The franchise also became increasingly self-aware and comedic, particularly in later installments, like Jason X, which sent Jason to space, and Freddy vs. Jason, a crossover with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. This tonal shift from serious horror to camp reflects how audiences become desensitized to repeated exposure, requiring either escalation or ironic distance to maintain engagement. While Jason Voorhees is a fictional character, his creation drew inspiration from real fears about water safety, camp accidents, and the vulnerability of children in recreational settings. Drowning remains one of the leading causes of death for children, and summer camps have occasionally been sites of genuine tragedies that resonate with the franchise's premise. The idea of a child drowning due to counselor negligence, while dramatized in the films, reflects real concerns parents have about entrusting their children's safety to others. Camps rely on young staff members who may prioritize socializing over vigilance, a dynamic that creates genuine anxiety even in the absence of homicidal maniacs. The deformity Jason suffers in the films also connects to historical realities. Children born with physical differences have often faced cruel treatment, bullying, and social isolation. While the films don't explore this with particular sensitivity, the backstory of a disfigured child mocked and excluded taps into real experiences of marginalization and the psychological damage such treatment causes. Some have speculated about specific incidents that might have influenced the Friday the 13th creators, though no single event stands out as a direct inspiration. Rather, the franchise synthesizes common fears, familiar settings, and archetypes that resonate because they reflect genuine anxieties, even if the specific narrative is invented. Jason's hockey mask serves crucial psychological and narrative functions that help explain his enduring impact. Masks have appeared throughout human history in religious rituals, warfare, theater, and execution contexts where hiding the face serves specific purposes. Understanding what masks do psychologically illuminates why Jason's blank visage remains so effective. Masks dehumanize both wearer and victim. For the wearer, concealing one's face reduces inhibition and accountability, a phenomenon called de-individuation, where people act more aggressively when anonymous. For victims and observers, a masked face removes the humanity we normally perceive through facial expressions, making the person seem more like an object or force than a fellow human being. The hockey mask specifically carries additional meaning. It's protective equipment designed to shield athletes from injury, now repurposed to conceal a killer's identity while he inflicts injury on others. This inversion is darkly ironic safety equipment, becoming associated with extreme danger, something meant to protect life now connected with death. The mask's blank, emotionless surface also creates psychological projection. Unable to read Jason's intentions or emotions through facial cues we normally rely on, audiences project their own fears and assumptions onto that blank surface. This makes Jason simultaneously less than human, no recognizable face, and more than human, a vessel for our darkest imaginings about what might lurk behind the mask. One of Jason's defining characteristics is his apparent indestructibility. He's been stabbed, shot, drowned, blown up, and subjected to various other fatal injuries, yet always returns in the next film. This quality transforms him from human killer into something more mythic, a force that cannot be permanently defeated. This immortality serves several narrative functions. Practically, it allows the franchise to continue indefinitely, with Jason returning no matter how conclusively he seemed destroyed in the previous installment. Thematically, It positions Jason as the return of the repressed, the past sin that can be temporarily suppressed but never fully erased, always ready to resurface. The inability to permanently kill Jason also reflects anxieties about consequences and accountability. The original sin of Camp Crystal Lake was negligence leading to a child's death, a wrong never properly addressed or atoned for. Jason represents that unresolved guilt made manifest, a debt that can never be fully paid because the ultimate consequence, a child's death, can never be undone. From a psychological perspective, Jason embodies the intrusive thoughts and fears that return despite our attempts to banish them. Like trauma that resurfaces in PTSD, or guilt that emerges despite attempts at suppression, Jason represents psychological content that refuses to stay buried. His immortality is the immortality of unresolved psychological material that haunts us until properly processed. Unlike many horror villains who revel in tormenting victims verbally, Freddy Krueger, or explaining their motivations, various others, Jason rarely speaks. This muteness is crucial to his character and effectiveness as a horror icon. Silence creates different psychological effects than speech, contributing to Jason's particular brand of terror. Silence removes the possibility of negotiation, reasoning, or human connection. Victims cannot plead with Jason, cannot appeal to his humanity, cannot find common ground through language. His muteness positions him as utterly other, operating by rules and motivations that cannot be communicated or understood. This creates existential horror beyond simple physical threat. The absence of speech also prevents audiences from fully understanding Jason's interiority. We don't know what he thinks or feels, whether he experiences satisfaction in killing or operates purely mechanically, whether he remembers his drowning or acts on pure instinct. This ambiguity makes him more frightening. The unknown is always more terrifying than the known. Jason's silence also creates space for victims' voices. Their screams, pleas, and final words stand out more sharply against his wordlessness. This dynamic emphasizes their humanity and vulnerability, while reinforcing his monstrous nature. He remains unmoved by sounds that should evoke empathy or mercy. The setting of Friday the 13th functions as more than mere backdrop. Camp Crystal Lake becomes a character in its own right, with particular qualities that shape the narrative and generate specific fears. Isolated locations have long featured in horror because they remove the safety nets of civilization, leaving characters vulnerable in ways urban settings don't permit. Lakes and forests carry particular symbolic weight. Water represents the unconscious and psychological symbolism, depths that hide unknown dangers, surfaces that deceive about what lies beneath. Jason emerging from the lake becomes the return of repressed content from the unconscious, the past surfacing to disrupt the present. Forests represent the uncivilized, the space beyond human control where natural law supersedes social order. Characters venture into this space believing they can maintain their civilized identities and behaviors, but the forest strips away those pretenses, revealing more primal dynamics of predator and prey, survival and death. The abandoned camp setting specifically evokes a particular melancholy, a place meant for joy and growth left to decay, innocence corrupted by tragedy. Empty buildings and rusting equipment suggest futures that never materialized, potential forever unrealized. This decay mirrors Jason himself, a child who never grew into adulthood, frozen in time at the moment of his death. Friday the 13th's influence extends far beyond its direct sequels, shaping horror cinema, popular culture, and even language. Friday the 13th itself gained additional superstitious weight from the franchise's success, with the date now inseparably linked to Jason in public consciousness. The films helped establish slasher conventions that dozens of later films would follow or deliberately subvert. Jason became a cultural touchstone, appearing in everything from video games to action figures to costumes worn by millions. This commercialization represents an interesting paradox. A character designed to terrify becomes domesticated through familiarity and merchandising, transformed from nightmare figure to nostalgic icon. The franchise also sparked significant academic interest, with scholars analyzing its gender politics, moral framework, class dynamics, and mythic structures. Whether Friday the 13th films are misogynistic exploitation or complex texts about trauma and guilt remains vigorously debated, with evidence supporting multiple interpretations. While Jason dominates the franchise, the final girl archetype, the lone female survivor who confronts and defeats the killer, proves equally significant. These characters, from the original film's Alice Hardy through various sequels, embody specific qualities that merit examination. They're typically portrayed as more sensible than their peers, less likely to engage in risky behavior, and ultimately resourceful enough to fight back. This pattern has been interpreted in contradictory ways. Some see it as empowering, showcasing female strength, intelligence, and survival ability. Others view it as conservative moralism, rewarding good, sexually chaste, sober girls while punishing bad ones. Both readings have merit, and the films themselves contain elements supporting each interpretation. The final girl's confrontation with Jason often involves role reversal, where the presumed victim becomes aggressor, using Jason's own weapons or the environment against him. These moments provide catharsis, allowing audiences who've identified with vulnerable characters to experience triumph. They also complicate simple victim-aggressor dynamics, showing that violence can flow in multiple directions under extreme circumstances. Recent Friday the 13th media have attempted to update the franchise for contemporary audiences while maintaining core elements that made it successful. The 2009 reboot, for instance, presented a more tactical, intelligent Jason, while condensing the franchise's mythology into a single cohesive narrative. These reinterpretations reflect changing audience expectations and cultural contexts. Contemporary horror audiences are often more sophisticated, aware of genre conventions, and expecting either subversion or more complex engagement with familiar tropes. This creates challenges for franchises rooted in straightforward slasher formulas. How do you maintain what made a character iconic while adapting to audiences who've seen it all before? Some recent interpretations have explored Jason's perspective more sympathetically, positioning him as a victim seeking revenge for genuine wrongs rather than simply a monster. This reflects broader cultural interest in villain origin stories and moral complexity. Whether such approaches enhance or undermine Jason's effectiveness as a horror icon remains debated among fans. The suggestion that Jason Voorhees, or incidents resembling his story, might be real represents a common phenomenon in horror fandom, the desire to believe that fictional terrors have some basis in reality. This impulse serves several psychological functions worth examining, even as we acknowledge that Jason is fundamentally a creative invention. Believing horror has real-world roots enhances its effectiveness. If we can tell ourselves, this could actually happen, we grant permission to fully engage with the fear response, rather than maintaining safe emotional distance. The based on a true story framing, even when misleading or false, removes barriers to immersion. This dynamic also reflects how contemporary folklore operates. Urban legends and creepypasta often present as factual accounts, mixing real details with invention in ways that blur boundaries deliberately. The question, is it real, becomes less important than the story's cultural function, what fears it expresses, what warnings it conveys, what role it plays in community meaning-making. In Jason's case, the fictional elements are clear. No immortal killer stalks any real Camp Crystal Lake. But the fears the character embodies are genuine, about child safety, about consequences for negligence, about the return of unresolved trauma. In this sense, Jason is real, as a cultural expression of authentic anxieties, even if the literal story is invented. Jason Voorhees has survived 4 decades of horror cinema evolution because he embodies something fundamental about human psychology and cultural anxiety. The simple concept, a wronged child returning as an immortal killer, contains layers of meaning that audiences continue unpacking. He represents consequence and accountability, the return of repressed guilt, the punishment of transgression, and the terrifying possibility that some wounds never fully heal. The franchise's longevity also demonstrates horror's unique relationship with its audience. Unlike most genres where familiarity breeds contempt, horror fans often derive pleasure from encountering familiar formulas executed well. They want to be scared by what they know, finding comfort in the predictable structures, even as they seek novel variations. Jason's mask has become one of cinema's most recognizable images because it successfully distills complex fears into a simple visual icon. That blank hockey mask represents everything unknowable and threatening, every danger that watches silently from the shadows, every consequence we hope will never catch up with us. It removes individuality to represent universal threat. Anyone could be behind that mask, or conversely, that mask could hunt anyone. The question of what inspired Jason matters less than understanding why he continues resonating with new generations. The specific creative decisions that brought him to screen Victor Miller's script, Tom Savini's makeup effects, the various actors who've embodied the role combined with cultural anxieties and archetypal fears to create something larger than its components. Jason transcends his origins to become a modern myth, a cautionary tale updated for contemporary contexts, but rooted in timeless human concerns. Whether Friday the 13th represents the best or worst of horror cinema depends on perspective and priorities. What's undeniable is its impact on the genre, on popular culture, and on how we process fears about childhood vulnerability, consequence, and the past's refusal to remain buried. Jason Voorhees stalks our collective imagination not despite, but because of his simplicity, his silence, and his unstoppable nature. He embodies the fear that some mistakes have permanent consequences, that some wrongs can never be righted, and that what we bury in dark water will inevitably surface again.